All right, greetings, everyone. Welcome back to our second session on Mahdi Amel's work. We are reading the sort of second section of a two-part essay, which we started on colonialism and underdevelopment from our first session, and now we're looking at the colonial mode of production. And in this piece, we really get the Althusserian thrust of Amel's thought is really, it's really put out there, and in a very interesting way. What we have here is a quite ambitious effort to make an argument against a lot of dependency theorists, Marxist theorists like Bettelheim, that the conception that they have of the colonial mode of production or of a colonial sort of society's relationship to hegemonic capitalist mode of production has an all too easy Hegelian philosophical foundation to it. And that struck me as a very interesting application of the Althusserian critique of Hegel, what Amel refers to as identitarian thinking, that prevents us to adequately grasp the nature of a contradiction. And it also prevents us from grasping the differentiation between the very unique status of a colonial mode of production. And so he does not quote Althusser. In fact, he says that he quotes really Marx, and Marx from the Grundrisse. And the argument that unfolds here is the idea of a contrast of thinking overlapping modes of production, say feudal, capitalist, mercantilist, etc., but how the colonial mode of production is not reducible to a simple overlapping conception. And that in Hegelian thought, you have this idea of the synthesis, which we know in vulgar Hegelian dialectical thought, the synthesis of various parts sort of represents a kind of unity of the various parts. But it does not necessarily imply that from that unity, something distinctively or qualitatively new emerges. Still, the whole, the conception of the whole is subordinated to the multiplicity of the parts that compose the thing. And he says that Marx, in the Grundrisse, develops a concept of fusion, and he contrasts this to Hegelian synthesis. Now, the first thing to note is that you would immediately associate the Hegelian conception of Aufhebung in line here with these three terms: synthesis, fusion, Aufhebung. And I think that he chooses fusion precisely because of its relationship to chemistry. And he thinks that the colonial mode of production represents this very peculiar, unique emanation of a qualitatively distinct mode of production that we'll remember from last time is not capitalistic, but is subordinated to the dominant or hegemonic capitalist mode of production. And nor is it reflective of the prior modes of production that subordinated the colonial locale. It actually is something in between those, but it is distinctive. And it is defined and characterized by a unique form of domination. And he spends quite a lot of time discussing this very important distinction in Marx, which everyone I think should be familiar with, between forces of production and relations of production. And this distinction is essential precisely because for Amel, I think, and I would like for Ziad to perhaps weigh in on this, there is at work here a very interesting argument, I think, about how the colonial mode of production introduces a distinct form of class differentiation on the one hand, but also, and this is very interesting when we think about places like Gaza, a unique form of domination, which, because we have this fusion of the colonial mode of production, this form of domination is qualitatively different in its application, in its brutality, in its character. And that was very interesting to me because it's at that point where revolutionary violence against this distinct mode, this fusional mode of production, what he calls colonial mode of production, must be concentrated, must be focused upon, it must be abolished in that sense. And part of the problem, of course, is that there is a kind of latent developmentalist ideology, implicit in dependency theorists, who would argue that if a colonial society went through bourgeois reforms and was capable of undergoing a capitalist revolution in their mode of production, that this would adequately maybe, overcome the colonial mode of production. And Amel does not seem to agree with that at all, in fact. So the other important point here is that what allows Amel to derive this conception of fusion in his conception of the colonial mode of production itself, and I was speaking in a correspondence with Nadia about this, is his distinction that he does touch upon. And we remember in Political Unconscious by Jameson, we have three forms of causality: mechanistic, expressive, and structural. And just as a reminder, it is the structural form of causality that Althusser really, I think you could say, sort of like innovates or invents or gives to Marxism and so on. So it's kind of funny that Amel is saying, well, we find this in Marx. Like the quotation in the footnote is not to Althusser, but it is actually to Marx. Probably, I would assume, Ziad, he's making that because he's making an argument to fellow Marxists, some of whom may not like Althusser. And it's better to make your argument to the source, as it were. But what is structural causality? We remember that structural causality is the sort of conception in which you have an absence of the cause within the structure itself, and thereby the structure is effectively metonymic. This is the form that the structure takes, almost like a kind of unique interior unto itself, and it does not necessarily require a pre-existing object or element that produces its causes. It's a very complex conception, but I think it's related to this idea of how the fusional production of the colonial mode of production itself, out of this strange dynamic where you have a mercantile prior mode of production, and then you have a sort of colonial society which is basically subordinated to a sort of direct adherence to capitalist mode of production, but ultimately they are subordinated to finance capital. What is being deprived, again, is the productive mode that's possible for the subjects within that colonial relation. Now, you could get quite fancy and sort of, I think, almost sort of hints at some of this stuff about how structural causality represents a different form, in fact, of representation and therefore of dialectics. And I think we should actually, in our conversation, and I'm going to open it up in a moment, sort of go back to some of the quotes and passages when he's comparing what he calls the Marxist dialectic versus the Hegelian dialectic. And we'll see, I think, where structural causality allows us to see what he calls difference instead of identity in the mode of production. And why does this all matter, by the way? It matters because he wants to retain a strident orthodox Marxist position, which is that any revolution necessitates and entails a revolution in the mode of production. So as such, we have to understand and isolate the core mode of production that dominates our society, in this case, the colonial society. So there's more to be said about structural causality, and we can come back to that. As a reminder, we could think of relations of production simply as the who of the capitalist system, as the material base of the capitalist system. It's the class formation, it's the division of labor, it's property. And we can think of the forces of production as the how, which is labor power, means of production, tools, instruments, etc. of production. Okay. And there's a constant correspondence between relations of production and productive forces, right? And this constitutes the economic structure of any given society. But he also wants to make the claim that one of the problems with predominant Marxist accounts of colonialism is that if you don't understand the relationship between these two spheres adequately, you will conclude a sort of misreading of the historical basis of your own society. And I think this term historical is very interesting because what that means is that you can then misconstrue essence and appearance. And you can then misconstrue the the sort of practice, the practice of the party, the practice of the socialist movement. Because from this analysis of the mode of production, we are generating a type of set of prescriptions for political action. On the one hand, on the other hand, we're also making claims about the direction of the mode of production in our social locale itself. So it's a dynamic process. The conclusions that we reach from it is a dynamic process, and he's saying that a sort of Hegelian Marxism is inadequate. Is inadequate, and I forget the precise point where he says it's inadequate. Perhaps somebody could bring it up. I think it's worth looking at where he makes this point about essence and appearance, and the contrast between that. Um, Another interesting point that I wanted to flag again is that um, while he does sort of agree that the colonial condition is almost like forced into a state of domination akin to almost like an arrested development, right? Whereby revolution would and must entail the freeing of the productive forces in the colonized country through like a revolutionary act, right? Um, I suppose his problem with that is that the conception of the class orientation for doing that, if it follows in line with national bourgeoisie interests and their conception of the situation, what would be the problem with that? Wouldn't it be that they would advocate revolution towards capitalist productive development? That would be the problem, right? That seems pretty clear to me. And it's pretty obvious then. But also very clear how the Marxists in this context will be otherized by the intelligentsia in a colonial locale. Because the proposal for that direction of revolution is could not be more different. Um, I found the whole second part of the essay, which turned to the question of classes, super fascinating. A lot of resonance with Fanon is found here, where you get statements from Amel such as, in the colonial context, it's very difficult to differentiate between peasant and working class because we have a lack of a stable productive sphere. I found that very interesting. I think that Ziad, you had mentioned something about Amel's conception of the working class from last time that I want to invite you to elaborate on. Because I also think that part of this does not mean what Fanon was advocating in Algeria, which Algeria had a much more advanced industrial proletariat than Lebanon, to my understanding. And I think as such, they posed more of a danger for solidarity with national bourgeoisie and comprador bourgeoisie than did the peasants. So one question I have is, can you, Ziad, help us and others help us articulate Amel's class theory? Is his class theory very distinctive to Lebanon, or actually is there a class theory which is derived from the theoretical basis of the colonial mode of production itself? I'd like to sort of get a better grasp on that as well. But this is a very dense essay. My proposal is that we actually excerpt a few things, read them. It will help us as a great refresher to the Althusser readings that we did in For Marx, because Nadia said, like, yeah, the secret to this text is actually two things. One, a recognition that structural causality is the sort of key concept that he's working with to isolate the colonial mode of production. But then you know what else she said? Sartre is the second major influence in the second part of the essay on classes. And that's very interesting because in the Sartre, and specifically, of course, the critique of dialectical reason, right? I don't know if comrades have read that text. That's a very interesting point, though, because on the one hand, you get this conception of the fused group, which is sort of a uh, it's sort of not exactly a Marxist conception of class theory. It's sort of found within this sort of like it's a very almost like pre-Badiouian conception of I don't know if folks have read the Critique of Dialectical Reason, but you know it's like this kind of rare moment group fusion revolt model. Um, he develops this very interesting concept of the apocalypse, which is like his own theory of revolutionary violence. And he tries to develop these kind of conceptions of how revolutionary groups sort of break from seriality. It's almost like a quasi-anarchist argument in some ways. I find it very compelling. Um, but I was slightly unclear about how Sartrean. Nadia said that the Sartrean conception emerges in almost theory of the bourgeoisie, and I wasn't clear about how that worked. So that's actually a question that I have. Those are some of my main opening remarks. I found this notion, of course, of the overlapping modes of production quite useful in the sense that, one of the things that emerges here is a theory of domination that is distinctive to feudalist, mercantilist, capitalist, and colonial. And I was wondering if one could sort of derive almost like a taxonomy of theories of domination from the colonial mode of production itself. What does that look like? To me, it seems to feel as if because you have this problem of the collapsing class consciousness combined with a kind of omnipotent paternalism that determines the entirety of the social order, it seems to me that you have something akin to almost like a quasi-feudalist dynamic, but almost very hesitant to make that connection. So I suppose the answer is that you have something very distinct, like it's a distinctive form of domination. And I suppose also, in addition to that, one would have to add a kind of social psychological analysis of that domination and its distinctiveness. I was reminded, for example, of Norman Finkelstein's claim that October 7th was a slave revolt. And the way in which that was curious to me, of course, because slavery is not necessarily a part of the colonial mode of production on the one hand, but then also like there's a certain unrigorous sense or an ahistorical sense that when we talk about colonial domination, what are we talking about? Are we sort of are we capable of being that loose in this sort of like, what's the analog? What's the referent point to think that form of domination? So that's a question I wanted to raise for you guys as well. I know there's many people in the chat. Evie, please jump in.
Yeah, so I was thinking about when you said quasi-feudalist, and Amel in the text used the phrase pseudo-feudalist. And I don't know if anybody else in here has read Samir Amin's Eurocentrism, but in it, he makes the argument that instead of using feudalist and the Asiatic mode of production, or pseudo-feudalist, or I mean, quasi-feudalist could be something else, right? But he's arguing that the category of Asiatic mode of production was always sort of a placeholder, awaiting a better articulation. And Amin argues that the intermediary stage between primitive communalism and capitalism can be understood best through the category of a tributary system. This category allows us to not use feudalism as the benchmark, right? While still addressing the thing that all of those post primitive communalism societies have in common, which is some sort of paying tribute to a sort of centralized bureaucracy that manages the distribution, right? So I say all that to say that there's a sense in which the dollar hegemony can be understood as a sort of tributary system, right?
Yeah,
Like by so then that tributary, that sort of global tributary system of imperialism, um, then can contain within itself different overlapping and interlocking modes of production, and the tributary category can still help us make sense of, for example, like Palestine, and even like Puerto Rico, right? These are both objectively colonized places, and there's capitalist looking stuff happening there, but it's more tributary in some ways than anything else. And so yeah, I'm just in love with Samir Amin's articulation of that intermediary stage. So it seems to me like the imperialist, like the global tributary system, has tasked itself with like making zones of non-development or
right.
underdevelopment that nevertheless pay tribute.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he says that the colonial mode of production um, is prohibited from existing as an autonomous mode of production, and it exists within this dependent subordinate role. And so there's that dynamic. But I just want to say one quick thing before we go to Akshay, just to sort of revisit this wider philosophical claim that he's making about the error of Marxist dependency theorists that are too Hegelian. Just want to reference, this is 48, 49 for people that want to look at it. Um, almost says that um, against the idea of Bettelheim, who he's using as a kind of paradigmatic example of Hegelian Marxist that gets dependency theory wrong, um, uh, he thinks that the conclusion that capitalist development is a foundation and necessary phase of colonized countries to go through, um, that inevitably that's what they will posit. And again, that goes back to his original point from the first part of the essay, where he's sort of against the Marxist teleological conception, because the Marxist teleological conception would have you think that the undergoing of the mutation or transformation of the colonial mode of production through a capitalist phase is necessary. And Amel is sort of rejecting this. That is why a lot of like contemporary Marxists on like today's left claim that Althusser is not a Marxist. But you see, they're thinking that in part, one, because he's a structuralist, but also they're thinking because he allows for the circumvention of revolution not having to go through the capitalist. So that was one interesting point. But then the other point that he makes is that this form of thinking cannot see a unity in the movement of differentiation between two structures, which is a movement by which both structures both modes of production, develop a single structural unity. That is the colonial mode of production, right? And he says the Marxist dialectic, and he's juxtaposing this to the Hegelian dialectic, is the only dialectic that reveals this because it is at its base the movement of reality itself, which is a movement of differentiation and unevenness bound in the unity of contradictions. In this dialectic, the causes, in the Hegelian dialectic, okay, causes become invisible and the contradictions become metaphysical. They become ultimately of the mind of the bourgeois reformer. They become a cryptic secret, knowable only to God and to the masterfully deceptive guardians of bourgeois capitalist ideology. That was one of my favorite parts of the essay. Okay, Akshay, please.
Yeah, I mean, I also really enjoyed the chapter, but I guess like a question I kind of had reading it the whole time is sort of like how Amel is sort of defining like a unit. And it's also, I mean, we were just reading on reproduction right before this, right? So, and it's the differences with Althusser are a little, like for example, for Althusser, like all social formations have at a minimum sort of like two modes of production. So I was already a little sort of confused about what he meant that like colonialism is sort of like unique in having like two modes of production. Or, and I mean, and I'm kind of stumbling upon this like he has a lot of really interesting sentences where he says things like what is it? The unity of the kind of like colonial liberation struggle, it derives from like the unity of like the situation of domination, right? Um, but again, I mean, like it's in Althusser's text, he has this like very long extended meditation on like two different kinds of unity, right? Like there's the unity of the bourgeoisie internal to itself, and then there's the unity of like the bourgeoisie and proletariat as part of one system. And again, it's sort of this question of, well, where do you draw the boundary? What's internal to itself? And the other kind of interesting sentence I thought Amel had was that it's not sort of the seizure of political power, that like it's kind of the colonial relation can sort of like continue to. And I was kind of curious, like, so read from a kind of contemporary lens, like, you know, which of our sort of post-colonial countries would he
Mm.
read as sort of post-colonial and which is sort of re-colonial, continuing colonial, you know, like that's the, I mean, between say like, you know, China to Vietnam to India to, uh, yeah. So I mean, and I was wondering, so how is he defining the unit and therefore this like the correspondence of, you know, the unity of domination and the unity of the struggle as having this sort of like real connection.
Yeah, thank you very much, Akshay. I have only a premonition of the second part of that, but not so much the first. And I would maybe invite Ziad at some point to jump in, but let's go to maybe we could hold that. You could just retain that, Ziad, and we can kind of come to that later. Um, yeah, because almost new to me. So please, Utume.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting text to read now. In my discussions, it's interesting because most of them are actually with people who want to think of colonial or post-colonial societies or neocolonial societies. And I have a comment about that line as well of jumpstarting into the capitalist stage. In 2025, that seems to be the dominant argument. And in this text, which is interesting, I think you find some great ammunition of why that is a foolhardy move. I think especially when he says the line, the colonial mode of production did not develop historically within the framework of capitalism's development in the West, especially not its formative phase, but rather within the social structure of the colonial relation. So one of the things that I've gotten into conversations is this idea that when the colonial societies went into these things, they became part of the capitalist system, so thus they are capitalist systems, right? And this is and they've found their different things that kind of work within capitalism, these are kind of artisanal things or so forth and so on. But there is a lack of analysis, and I think Amel gets this really right, that what we have now happened within the colonial situation, and it distorts our history. Because one of the things you hear is they say, well, look at our history. This is our history. This is our historical thing, right? And that's a distortion. There is not a robust analysis of what happened within colonialism that distorted the social relations, and thus, makes us think that, Akon can come into Africa and, make it into the future land, which we, I don't know if people paid attention to that, what Akon did there. I mean, nothing has ever happened, but he sold this like we just need this kind of jump start into a capitalist dream. And I think Amel's arguments really throw cold water onto this very pro-capitalist idea that all these colonial societies need is a kind of jumpstart the same way the United States did, in the Industrial Revolution and so forth and so on. It's really, I think, great stuff to kind of throw at that, which I will say in a lot of people who come from these societies, like so it's myself historically, it is the prevailing argument, right? That we need to step into capitalism, even if people have a kind of, you know, some kind of like for socialism as a possible idea. They say, we're not there yet. So they've kind of adopted a thing. I also found it interesting he threw his hat into the colonialism debate of the usage of that language, which still goes on today. I still have that conversation with it. I'd be curious. I felt like he didn't really give a robust answer as why he gave, but I could be wrong. If he wanted to correct on that. But I found that interesting where he kind of stamped his flag on to a debate that still happens today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's this whole business on class formation is another thing we should hit upon, where he basically says class becoming cannot be thought in a colonial mode of production, which I found very interesting. Perhaps, uh, perhaps not necessarily a pessimistic claim, but again, going to this notion of what he thinks social reality is now open to us. What the implications of that are seem to be quite profound, insofar as it's not that you have like a kind of I don't know, like a full lumpenized class situation, like like you can think lumpen proletariat not only as like a static relation, but also as like a verb, as like an active process of incoherence to every class, especially to the possible revolutionary agent. That may be where the Sartreanism comes in with Amel, where he's trying to think revolution beyond mechanistic materialist relations of class. That's another thing that frankly, he doesn't fully develop it enough for me to really judge where he's landing on that. But I'm very curious about that. Jairo, welcome to our study group. It's nice to have you. Please jump in.
I know I had to come in because the last session was just incredible. I mean, wow, you all brought so much depth and really, really interesting analysis and assessments and questions. So I wanted to start by saying I was so surprised when I read the article that came out in the New Yorker about men. It's like what is it called? Or rather, so it's called "What Did Men Do to Deserve This?" With the subtitle being "Changes in the Economy and the Culture Seem to Have Hit Them Hard," and it's looking at particularly surveying the work of the author Scott Galloway, who's been a really public figure in a lot of like progressive media, who talks about needing a new quote unquote aspirational vision of masculinity. But the article actually isn't really about this kind of like gender war thing. She chooses to look, the author, Jessica Winter, she chooses to look at it through the lens of class. And honestly, when I tell you like this article is essentially lifting this framework of this essay that we just read, you see it outlined exactly what he's talking about in terms of like the social relations, in terms of how this aspiration vision is built. She outlines how the erosion of like the manufacturing base in the United States and the different kinds of labor struggles and the broader kind of global capitalist system, how this spiraled into a situation in which the social category of man and the social relevance of being a man traditionally in society changes and has continued to evolve, and now we've reached this point where people are saying there's just a crisis around masculinity. So it's a
Right.
really, really interesting article. I highly recommend it because like I said, it actually really complements the reading we just did really beautifully. And she does add a very clear class analysis to it, as opposed to just why are boys sad. Like, it was like really kind of rigorous, I would argue. And was that the only thing I wanted to say? I think so. Sorry, I lost. There was something else I wanted to say, but I completely just slipped out of my mind.
Oh,
So yeah, I guess
no
I'll
worries.
just start with that recommendation.
Fabulous. And what's the name of the article again?
It is called What Did Men Do to Deserve This? And that's
Yeah.
by Jessica Winter in The New Yorker.
Okay, I think I saw that. I haven't read it yet. That's amazing. I just want to read a passage just to bring us all on the same page regarding what Amel theorizes is the colonial mode of production. This is very clear, I think. He says, in breaking the feudalist framework in which social production had developed, capitalist production effectively freed the forces of social production from the constraints that had previously limited them within the larger social structure. As a result, these forces became independent from the social structure that had initially produced them. And this very independence is what defines and serves as the foundation for the existence of a mode of production. However, the colonial mode of production lacks this essential characteristic. You see the point there? Colonial mode of production is not really like a mode of production. Okay? What distinguishes the colonial mode as a mode of production is paradoxically the very quality that prevents it from fully becoming one. Its potential to exist as an autonomous mode of production is inseparable from the impossibility of ever fully realizing its autonomy. Fascinating, right? Now, the outcome of this, the consequence of this, is a sort of eternal repetition of the conditions of dependency ad infinitum. This reproduction of a colonial mode relies on ideology. It relies on ideology against which a revolution in thought becomes necessary. This goes back to Ziad's point about uh, the importance of the Communist Party functioning as a ideological force. Precisely through sort of tearing apart this kind of idealized dialectic of the historic. See, now I'm actually starting to respect Althusser's contribution because I can now see it. I can now see it. The kind of blindness that perhaps some, maybe not all, but some Hegelian conceptions of the quote unquote historical dialectic would impose. It would be a false ideology. So it totally therefore makes sense that it's kind of like you need almost like Marx and Engels's German ideology to understand the way that colonial intellectuals would obscure the fact of the true social reality of the mode of production that dominates the people. That is very powerful, I think. That is very, very unique. Um, yes, very, very unique. Ziad, would you want to maybe jump in and say a few things?
Hi,
Is this yours?
Daniel. Yes, I put down some notes for some things to address. When he initially started writing this, he was thinking about Algeria, Egypt, and Lebanon. Of course, the situation is quite different for all these countries. Egypt under Nasser uh, strays completely from Lebanon and Algeria. But what's important at the time is that in rebuking the question of feudalism, is that he was responding to a bunch of um developmentalist intellectuals who are still trying to articulate that we don't really have a proper capitalism yet, and we are still bound, we're still tied to the fetters of feudal relations. And he says this is not true. This is false. It's not a question of a hybridity or a question of remnants. So in addition to this, he says that, and this is something that he still had retained in this point from Fanon, that the national bourgeoisie is a pure structural fiction. It's a structural illusion that they cannot undergo a bourgeois revolution. They're still very much a colonial bourgeoisie tied to a mere bourgeoisie that is still lying in the imperial core. To address the question of Sartre, his PhD, which is not public or translated yet, is the place where his Sartrean elements really shine, and you still see elements in that in his piece on Fanon, and decreasingly as he writes, he's kind of writes Sartre out of his intellectual life. But yeah, Nadia is right. The question of fused groups, how he's thinking about the centripetal and centrifugal forces and how to bring about this fusion, very much is owes to Sartre. One thing I want to add here on Charles Batelheim is that he is actively arguing against other Marxists who either are still in Arabic, who, for example, like Ilyas Murus in Syria, who's thinking about an Asiatic production. And he's also running against Samir Amin. And him bringing in Charles Batelheim, and he uses the term superposition. In English translation, it's been translated as intermixed, but he's thinking that there is an overlapping of different elements, different articulations of modes of production, but what is produced is differential totalization, and he uses this term of a creation of something new. So he's very much thinking of along an Althusserian reading of the Verbindung, right, against combinatory. And the last thing I wanted to bring here, and we can keep this for later, is that he creates he places in an antagonistic position the Hegelian dialectic to a Marxist to a dialectic, where for the Hegelian dialectic, of course, because if you have an Aufhebung at the end, sublation. For him, this becomes the diffusion of any new radical politics. If anything, that is the practice that enshrines, that vouchsafes a reproduction of a colonial reproduction. So it vanishes the antagonism during the process, whereas in a Marxist dialectic, it's the transformation of the opposition, right, to the struggle. And he identifies the Hegelian with the bourgeoisie, right? So the bourgeoisie remain in identification with themselves, right? So for him, Hegel becomes like a perfect for capitalism, right? He is speaking on behalf of the structure, and he identifies that with bourgeois practices, whether political, economic, or ideological.
Yeah, there's another. Thank you very much, Ziad. There's another, I think, important concept of what he calls class substitutionism that we should throw onto the table here. If folks want to reference this, this is on page 76, 77, 78. And this falls into a very interesting dynamic whereby, because you have a kind of fundamental incoherence around the possibility of the sparking or the maturing of class consciousness, precisely because you have this paternalistic sort of arrested development situation that we've just articulated. He actually thinks, perhaps in an optimistic way, and this is where I think the Sartrean theory of revolution would be brought into play. He thinks that this class substitutionism could actually elevate to a political potential, and perhaps, and I may be wrong about this, but perhaps this is to do with the fact that you have almost like a muted class struggle amongst the differentiated classes, say petty bourgeois, working class, lumpen proletariat, and so on. So I was even thinking of that film Us by Jordan Peele, where you have a substitution theory of like the black middle class in the United States in this very like dystopian way. You guys remember that film? Uh, that came to mind to me. Jacques Rancière's theory of lumpenization in his reading of the 18th of Brumaire came to mind. What is weird, or what is very interesting and perhaps most optimistic about this section of the essay, is that he seems to still think that a political revolution can be organized in the context in which you have effectively a very difficult time to mobilize class consciousness. So let me just make a little reading, and then we'll immediately go to Jaira here. Okay. We would like to make, stability of the social structure, which is a condition for the lack of so-called political stability in colonial societies, differs absolutely from the structural stability of Western capitalist societies. In the capitalist West, structural stability is actually a direct result of the structure's dynamism, or more precisely of the particular kind of social dialectic that exists between differentiated classes. As for the stability of structure in colonial societies, it is conversely a result of the paralysis of the social dialectic that occurs amongst undifferentiated classes. At the same time, this paralysis necessarily results in a persistently undifferentiated class structure. The non-differentiation of social classes in colonial societies is thus at once the cause and effect of this paralysis. The historical trajectory of these societies become, as a result, ambiguous. In order to highlight the difference between colonial and Western capitalist structures, we should perhaps reserve the use of the word fixedness to exclusively describe the former, and the word stability to describe the latter. So anyways, he then goes on to say that you can't really do studies of class becoming, or what we call in Marxist class formation. That's a very important point. So like, E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class, is not really possible in these contexts, which goes to Utume's point about history and cultural heritage. So you then have but I would call something like this, like lump, I would use sort of trauma. Maybe trauma could be, because he also says it becomes necessary to have like a psychological analysis of this condition. So this is a very interesting point. I'm going to stop and go to Jaira and then to Tume.
So immediately, I think Haiti came up as like the most prescient application of a lot of his logics that he's formed. Um, and I'm thinking specifically about the textile industry and the way that that was implanted by the United States, particularly Hillary Clinton. And that was a measure of a lot of very coercive dependency. And obviously, even going back to the whole, France refusing to relinquish this cash debt that they have on Haiti. And I hear people all of the time say directly to me, like, how is it possible that it's such a shit show over there? Like, it's always such a train wreck. These people just can't get it together. And there's a lot of, that has that sentiment of what you're talking about, with where the lack of like the stable sense of social structures then reflects on people's analysis as, these people are faulty, or these people are operating in some kind of a way, without any acknowledgement that there are no real formal thriving sectors of labor there that are allowed to stand on their own without direct interference from the United States on multiple levels. And this is like, even all the way back to when Biden was in Senate, he was doing, rounds assuring that there needed to be a way to manage a crisis that hadn't even started yet. And there's that infamous clip of him saying, like, who would even care if God forbid, Haiti just like sank to the bottom of the ocean? Like, no one would give a fuck, because like, what are these people contributing? So there's very much this attitude of like, even you can't even place it. So there is maybe like an agricultural sector that we could maybe look at as a something that is involved in their national economy, but even that is like there is no it's not being brought into the international trade systems. They operate completely exterior to all of this, similarly to Cuba because of its blockade. And then you look next door at the Dominican Republic, and I walk around the Seaport District in Boston, which is kind of like our Silicon Valley. It's a high tech, high earners. They're trying to kind of redesign this whole space and make it a very specific and very exclusive. And you see advertisements to travel to the Dominican Republic. So it's like there's this way in which like the DR's positive relationship with its colonial history, this kind of like absorption of that within the social structures within our national identity creates this very positive relationship where in Boston, I'm walking around being advertised this island, but I would never see the same thing for Haiti. So it's like these lineages get replicated in such distinct but very, very obvious ways through all different forms of this kind of like advertising and just the hypercapitalism of the United States. But it's very evident to me when you look at Latin America and the Caribbean, and you really see like how these kind of feudal societies form themselves in places where agriculture or land-based struggle is still quite prominent, and it's up against this battle of like development and the encroachment of the United States capital system saying like, okay, you guys need to be working on, tech, or you guys need to be working on this or that, which is what makes, Trump's like bombing of these Venezuelan ships even funnier, because it's like anyone who really knows about how land-based struggle has been operating, say within Venezuela or Colombia, knows that the United States has been facilitating this with great ease for, I mean, decades at this point. And so much of the economy of these countries rests on the United States being highly permissive and hypocritical in how it conducts its trade and drug policies. So
Right.
yeah, I think like, you can really see the way that so many different countries that are attempting to grow out of a colonial background are very much still shaped by how they can or cannot contribute to the global capitalist system, if at all, and who's willing to do the bidding for them in order to help them build social structures that are accepted broadly, but also that are relevant to however the world is transforming.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that. I mean, on pages 80 through 82, 83, you'll get this really nice elaboration of the relationship that determines the domination of the working class in the colonial location. And he says that it's different than the West, precisely because, and Marx has some point that I think is articulated in the Brumaire regarding how the proletariat uh, initially begins seeing its class enemies through the petty bourgeoisie, through sort of minor class expressions, until it is capable of finally seeing its true enemy in the bourgeoisie. And what he says here, and this explains the essay on Islamism, and you could even apply Ziad, I think, in a nice Lukácsian way. The irrationalism of petty bourgeois ideology is very like distinct from an emanation from the colonial mode of production, because it is the dominance of petty bourgeoisie over the working class that blocks, at least at the level of class conflict, their freeing, their becoming into a class formation, as he says on 81, 82, that the working class sees its struggle for its own existence as a class, a struggle to free up the historical process in order for its class formation to take place. You see, because it's blocked, right? That's the unique class contradiction of colonial society. But then, of course, the implication of that is actually that the working class still remains the revolutionary agent in this way, in a certain way, even though we have this crisis of ideology, substitution, and undifferentiation, you see. So that's actually quite powerful, I feel. But I wonder if that gives us a structural way to understand, because we also know from the study of Marxism in general the type of strange ideologies that petty bourgeois reformers and revolutionaries make in a certain way, and how that is formed usually in a kind of hostility to the working class. So I wonder if others that have read more in this literature than I have, do you find Amel's claim here about the working class's role to be unique? Otume, please jump in.
Interesting, because reading this chapter again, I was also struck at the similarities between E. Franklin Fraser's argument in Black Bourgeoisie of the mythic class. I mean, that's the Fraser's argument is that there is no Black middle bourgeoisie class. It is a mythology because essentially they're subordinated to white capital power in that relation. And that book came out in the mid 50s. It actually came out first in French. And it's kind of a hallmark of sociological study. So I would not be surprised if Amel did not read this book. It is one of the, I know Fanon did, and he was someone who studied this book very, very clearly. And I think it could be helpful because he then talks about, in that kind of embodiment, in this kind of mythic way, they become extremely hostile to the Black working class, and they actually see them as like someone as like their primary enemy, right? And the one that they must go at the first, right? Even if there is immense white hostility towards their kind of social mobility, it's still probably largely more of the fault of the Black lumpen or the Black working class, who still does not have the ability to, get themselves together and pull their pants up straight. Right. But I found a lot of similarities. I looked back at some of, some Fraser quotes that I had underlined in the book, and I found a lot of crossover. And I think
Yeah.
if people wanted to look that over, I mean, it is also a great book, in itself. And I know it helped a lot of theorists over the years.
Yeah, that's very powerful. I had a practical question, Ziad. What is the third part of the essay? What is the third part? Because in the text, it just goes to something this on the sectarian state, which is not the third part of the essay. Do you know what it is?
There was never a third part of the essay,
Oh,
so
he didn't finish it.
no, just
Hilarious.
went straight to the
Oh,
books.
bless him. Well, that's actually unfortunate because everything is about it's you know what that's like, right? That's like the third volume of Capital where Marx has on classes and then he only writes like 2 pages and then Engels like it's like, okay, well, let me just see what Marx may have said. And oh, that's funny, man. Why is it always on classes that the Marxists never finish? My God. It's like the most important one. Akshay,
Yeah.
please.
I also didn't find Amel's argument like unique here. I think there's a few other people, like Banerjee in particular, but that you can. But what I did find sort of unique was just how Althusserian it is, and like how sort of formalistic the presentation is. And but anyway, so I wanted to single out one passage, maybe to just ask what everyone thought about it. It's like top of page 56, and he says. History is a movement that takes place within a determined structural framework rather than a repetitive, say, an ascending or undifferentiated movement external to such a framework. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I found that like really sort of arresting and striking, like where he's sort of placing history definitively inside structure, right? Like, and it also helps me understand a lot of this like contrast between development and what is sort of deformation and what is this kind of like serialization, bad infinity of like non-development and underdevelopment. So I don't know. I mean, I was wondering what others thought.
It's very interesting because on the one hand, he wants to eschew the teleological Hegelian conception of history while insist upon tying a whole conception of revolution to historical becoming. So that I found very interesting and very powerful, just as interesting as the whole debate between essence and appearance, and how, I mean, you could make it even maybe a fancy argument that Althusser, like a stupid argument, like Althusser allows us to be more Hegelian than Hegelian because that's the objective of Hegel. You could do that maybe, uh, even with the history point, perhaps. So I don't know, Matilda, what has been on your mind, or if anyone, if comrades wish to respond to page 56. This is a long essay. I just realized. My God.
It's
Please
a
go
long
ahead.
essay. Yeah, I feel like I'm having a harder time collecting my thoughts about this essay than the last one. I think, I guess like I kind of just tried to take his points about, is it overlapping? Is it not? It's a fusion of two structures and not two modes of production. I think Althusser might, say like, it's like at least two modes of production, one dominant, and he has like, I guess his formula is just a bit different, and how the two structures are each have their own, I guess. One differentiates, I guess, along the lines of what we imagine to be like European historical trajectory of Marxism, and then the other one is the undifferentiated one that repeats, and that you can't think the one without the other. And I thought that was useful to think about. But maybe what stood out to me was, like, I mean, a bunch of things, but one I wanted to bring up was like kind of perhaps his pessimism around national liberation movements. He says that like the best you can hope for is an independent dependence rather than a dependent dependence.
Yeah.
And it just made me question, like, I guess Lacerda's framework of his like international division of labor that's been made unequal by the imperial core, which
Right.
I think Amel like agrees with the point that like the origin of unequal development is related to that. However, not so optimistic about national liberation movements making, it's like for at least making like a qualitative change within that unequal international division of labor.
Yeah, that's the thing, right, Matilda? Because the standpoint of totality in Hegelian Marxism was not capable of positioning itself from within the colonial relation. That's the whole novelty of part one of the essay. We need to shift that, and we need to think how social reality emanates from our distinct colonial mode of reality. Not, it's almost like a topographical point, like like shifted like that. And then that's where you get this whole essence and appearance becoming of history. Again, he's sort of staying true to Hegel by removing the idealist Hegel, maybe in a certain way.
His difference with Hegel, which I mean, as far as like a kind of a caricature made sense to me, I guess, like, well, I'd have to collect my thoughts on this a little bit more, but he thinks like the difference, or at least his formula or whatever, is like Hegel's has these like elements that stand in contradiction to each other, and
Right.
well, but then he substitutes his formula of like two structures,
Yeah.
that each have their own contradiction.
It's an argument against empiricism and also against a particular, I can just quote it. It's on page 60.
Yeah, it's a bit
He
technical.
says, all of our inquiry is an attempt to define this form of dependency, and it's yielded the concept of colonial mode of production. At first glance, it might appear that the dependency at the core of this colonial mode of production invalidates any attempt to understand it as distinct from the capitalist mode of production upon which it depends. If this were true, i.e., if the appearance and essence of reality are the same, then it would be impossible to ever hold that underdeveloped countries submit to a particular logic of historical development. The basis of this solution, which conflates appearance with essence, is a false empirical understanding of dependency. This understanding is anchored in an empirical conception of causality that categorically rejects the possibility that two different structures may ever exist in a contradictory unity. Yeah.
So
Go ahead. And then this is Hegelian, not Marxist. That's Hegelian thinking is not Marxist. And again, the Marxist point is the reference to the Grundrisse that allows this, which is the same footnote that Althusser makes in For Marx on the unevenness in the unevenness chapter. But again, I think almost smart not to quote Althusser because of the but go on.
No. I'm gonna collect my thoughts again, and I'll pop back.
Excellent, Khadija, welcome.
Hi. This is my first time, so forgive me if I like make a mistake. But when you guys were talking about when I was reading that part where he talked about essence and appearance, and also just thinking about what Matilda said as far as reading the when he was talking about his sort of pessimistic view of national liberation movements, and I feel like I definitely lean more towards Lesotho there because at the end of the day, like Matilda said, the imperial core and that sort of kind of like stronghold that they have on the sort of development of the people in the peripheries does stunt their growth. But it's to me,
Right.
maybe I have to like reread it, but it's kind of like it's kind of almost similar to the same argument Fanon makes somewhat about like he had in Wretched of the Earth, he makes this distinction that like the leaders of national liberation movements kind of take on the character of the people that they're trying to free themselves from or something to that effect. But I feel like that's almost like sort of eliding sort of the sort of principal contradiction of the role imperialism, capitalist domination plays in sort of like stifling the sort of development of peripheries. And also just one point on the essence and appearance thing, which I find really, like you said, very true to Hegel and just very like very, very, very important. But it just made me think when Ntume was talking about like the E. Franklin Fraser, Black Bourgeoisie, it also made me think about like the situation in Trinidad right now. Like I'm from Trinidad, and the Prime Minister, Bashad Bessair, it just kind of made me think about like, these people, they kind of have to rely on the hegemonic, imperial country, mother country, to sustain them. Their existence is only as real as the maintenance of the sort of imperialist hegemon. And if that falls, they also begin to disintegrate with it. And it just made me think about that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I'd like to hear Ziad's point on the national liberation front because I'm not as clear on the historical dynamics there because you had Nasserism. This is after the 67 war. You had a lot of dynamics going on. Andrew, and then Ziad can jump in, please.
Yeah, I came in late to the discussion and I didn't really get a chance to read all of this chapter, so forgive me, but I wanted to still maintain solidarity and show up because I love being here and I love you guys. But I guess my response to this question concerning I don't know if I would call it a pessimism, but more of just like a criticism that I think is maybe aligned with his own Althusserian structuralism on the question of national liberation, because like juxtaposing it from Lacerda, right? I think Lacerda is valid with these national liberation movements and the struggle for recognition. And this aligns with his Hegelian understanding of Notrek, right? But I do think that what Mahdi Amel is pointing out, especially from the first essay, is that colonial relations seem to be a necessary base for the expansion and production of the logic of capitalism, right? And so I think if we focus so much, at least from my understanding of Amal, on the national liberation struggle and not realize the relation that this colonial mode of production still has and not attack, I guess, the structural dynamic, then we end up regressing back. I guess this goes back to my question to even Conrad in our Althusser group about overdetermination and even regression, right? I wonder if there is a regression to something else with regards to these national liberation struggles that fail in his eyes. That's just sort of my speculation regarding his criticism of pure national liberation fronts. It's not that like I mean they don't matter. It's just I think that there's something missing. I guess I wonder if even thinking about Samir Amin's delinking is relevant to this question concerning the structural dynamic that necessarily plays of colonial underdevelopment for capitalist expansion.
Yeah. Very nice. I mean, one of the things almost says in his heritage lecture on cultural heritage is that the sort of in utero form of class consciousness of the peasantry, subordinated to colonial mode of production, will lean towards national liberation demands, right? And that's kind of like the spontaneous ideology of the peasantry. Now, I mean, I think that there needs to be superimposed upon this a conjunctural analysis of what dynamics the international working class struggle is facing at any given time before we embrace or not embrace a given national liberation struggle. I mean, a national liberation struggle there's a lot of like variables and factors, including this whole dynamic about the ideological structure as to whether sort of interlaced with the demands is a sort of vulgar, sort of I don't know, certain like religious ideologies that may actually seek a type of petty bourgeois, because you could also see a kind of alliance between petty bourgeoisie and peasantry on this precise point, and which would then sandwich the working class and eliminate what's on order, because what's on order is a revolution in the mode of production.
Well, wouldn't
So
the question of populism also come up in that sort of collaboration of petty bourgeois and peasantry as well?
I think so. I think so. Although even speak about populism in the colonial mode of production context doesn't quite make sense.
Okay, yeah.
You see, because it's arrested development. It's this paternalism that's in a kind of it's in a kind of a state of abeyance from having full subsumption into productive control of the mode of production, and thereby this problem of the history. I don't want to. He doesn't use the word prehistory, but he talks about the becoming class formation of the working class after the revolution. Yeah, I mean, we can read the. I think it may be useful for us to read both the, perhaps if Ziad allows us to do so, the Fanon essay, but also the essay on cultural heritage. I think that'd be quite useful for us. That's actually one of his most important essays, if I'm not mistaken. Akshay, please.
You just, yeah, the word you just used, Daniel, subsumption, I think is like something I'm not sure if he uses, but I think is like quite central, like the and real and formal subsumption. But about the, I mean, just about the national liberation thing, like I didn't get the feeling that he was disavowing liberation as much as saying that it's very hard, and that like the actual sort of liberation in terms like what would the transformation of the state as a social relation be in like any particular nation state, like say, you know, if the Palestinian people won a nation state tomorrow, like what would it mean to actually abolish the colonial relation? Like that is very, very hard. That which isn't to say that it's like national liberation isn't possible, but it's, but I mean, I don't know, but you know, you have to recognize that obviously this is going to face like immense contradictions, right? Like in that sense. And I mean, I think that's what like the disparaging comparison with a military coup, like which would be precisely a change in leadership with no change in the relations of production, right? Like if you still have Fordism, factory work, everything's organized the same way. You still like, you know, beat children at school, but like you have a new president that doesn't change anything. That like, which is I think a good comment, and not an excess of pessimism.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, I feel like it's not so much that one has the luxury to eschew national liberation given the time that he's writing. It's national liberation seems to be the predominant way that class struggle is expressing itself. So it's not, is that would be like sort of, I don't know, idealist or kind of obscurantinist to not necessarily. He's a critic of it. I mean, obviously. So I don't know
I
if the
guess I just
comparisons to Lacerda are apt. But go ahead, Akshay.
the last line I would throw in is that yeah, like he's for the real of national liberation, but he's also like criticizing this like constant nationalist appropriation of the name of liberation without the substance, right? Like, and I think he's yeah, I mean, I think that's also partially what he's trying to get at.
Yeah, perhaps Ziad, you could tell us about the theoretical prolegomena to the study of the impact of socialist thought on the national liberation movement, the 72 text. You had mentioned that last time, but maybe you could elaborate more on that.
Sure. Actually, I was just going to say this, in that these two essays become the backbone of this book, which Daniel just mentioned. And his entire oeuvre was precisely on the question of national liberation. But for him, it's a question of where to start. He's writing after 67, where Israel defeats Nasser, takes over a lot of land, occupies it in Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. And it becomes a moment in the Arab world where it signals that state or national anti-colonial struggle is insufficient, especially when it's easily co-optable by a national bourgeoisie. He's looking at Egypt, he's looking at Syria, he's looking at Lebanon. But at the same time, you have other smaller new leftist communist action groups and movements. We also see the transformation of the movement of Arab nationalists into the PFLP and so on. And he's looking at both and he's warning we need to be careful of economism on one hand and voluntarism on the other. So for him, this entire process of just thinking about how to do national liberation properly. But for him, uh, he's a partisan of the party, right? He believes that it is the party form, the vanguard, the Marxist-Leninist party, that the sole body that could wage this. So there is a real struggle over the state. And as we discussed last time, it was precisely a revolution of multiple revolutions. So it's socialist, it's a revolution over the state, but also against forces of fascism and so on. So he's thinking on not just the question of whether national liberation should be critiqued or put within certain brackets, but more of a how to think about the structure of society so that we could build something that could grow. And he's doing this at a time where there was a lot of the Lebanese Communist Party was itself undergoing desalinization, opening itself, and he was a fierce critic of the party. Yeah.
That's very, very good. Thank you very much. Yes. And at first I was wondering who was it that assassinated Amel, and then I just realized that it was, they said, right-wing thugs. I wonder if there's like an interesting story about his assassination. But yeah. Oh, Connor's in the house as well. Welcome, Connor. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. What's up, everybody? Just sort of bouncing off of what Ziad was just saying. One of the moments from the essay that I liked is when he was talking about really a question of sovereignty, but more specifically, like the leaders of these respective third world countries. And if only they were to choose capitalism or socialism, they would become capitalist or socialist countries, right? And it's like, I just enjoy that moment because you can sense Amel's getting like frustrated here. Like part of what he's calling for is like, just because they say they're capitalist or socialist doesn't mean that they are. So we need to analyze what they're actually doing. But it seems as though like simmering in the background of that is this sort of like also a new left thing, right? Like either Moscow or Washington, but even like the sort of assumption of solidarity with third world countries just because they're third world countries is not good enough either, right? So a very Althuserian then like call for ruthless critique, right? So which I just like that a lot. But again, the major thing being this also is related to a question of sovereignty, which is of course related to national liberation, right? Like we don't have to depend on the leader. That's sort of that spirit. So
Yes. Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I mean he I suppose the other dimension that is very unique about him is that he argues that a lot of national liberation struggles think that they can be kind of like post-class in their analysis. And I think that his centering of the class problem is very unique here and very profound. And that seems to be quite interesting. Yes, yes. Matilda, please jump in.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some surprising ideas about class, I think, in this. I got the sense that,
Yeah.
like, he doesn't think that there's class in the structure of the colonial societies.
Right, right.
And that national liberation doesn't lead to class differentiation.
Brilliant. That's right.
Yeah, and it's just like, because the bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie, whoever they might be, would still only be representatives of the colonial bourgeoisie, the colonialist
Yeah, because
bourgeoisie.
national liberation does not abolish the colonial mode of production.
Yes.
Right? Right? I mean, that's actually the question,
Yes,
like, which
yeah,
would be like, if we follow the colonial bourgeoisie in the direction of revolution and we go capitalist, I think Amel's point is that we're still subordinated to this, right? Ziad is saying yes, so then I feel very
it's like
confirmed.
it's the question of like, can you outrun the unequal exchange? Like, can you do a national liberation movement and outrun it? Like, I imagine China in that way is like an example of someone who's created like escape velocity, you know, and it doesn't, I mean, I wonder what Amel thinks of China, and like if his writings are for the third world that doesn't include like China in it. I mean, or the question is like, is China like certainly going to escape the unequal exchange? It seems as though they are. And I don't think anyhow, I'll stop there.
Andrew, thank you very much, Matilda.
No, these are good points, because then it makes me think of like, yeah, are they still subordinated to the colonial mode of production? But then also like, the fantasy of like, national liberation being post-class. But I mean, I don't know Mahdi Amel's notion of the state, but I know Althusser to some large extent was still aligned with the Leninist idea of the state. And what is the state but the irreconcilability of class, antagonism? So I still feel like at the end of the day that there's still in some antagonism of the class, based upon the state, right? And so I think that still remains a problem, whether it's the representative of the colonial bourgeoisie, or if there's some way that they could somehow manage to escape colonial dependency. There's still this internalization of that dependency, but also just the class struggle that manifests via the state, right?
Right. Yeah, in that sense, he's still very much on the side of a kind of historical becoming, a kind of grand narrative of freedom. Like, it's not about like a class abolition precisely or exactly about class abolition. It's about the satisfaction for the stunts, for overcoming the repetitive and internal stunting of the working class subordinated to this condition. So therefore, it does look like something very different, I think, than say revolution in Western contexts. Which, again, like some of our comrades on the Marxist left today might again draw these conclusions. Well, this is not Marxist for you to say that, right? Which is such an interesting, and I dare I say, I mean, that is a Eurocentric claim.
It is, and it's very purist.
It really is.
It's very purist. I don't like that, especially like the controlling take of like, oh, it's petty bourgeois revolution. Like, I don't agree with that.
Yeah, but like if he says that, he's negating the granularity of Amel's argument regarding the freaking petty bourgeoisie to begin with, which is already accounted for in his system in a way that is fundamentally different than a more advanced capitalist mode of production. So, anyways, and Julie, please.
Okay, I was thinking about something that one of our comrades said last week. I think it was Jonah. And he was talking about, what does this teach us about peripheral areas within the imperial core? And there's this line in here that nobody's brought up yet that really jumped out at me in the text on page 69, where he says, generally speaking, the contrast visible in colonial societies such as India and Indonesia between extraordinary poverty and opulent mansions with flashy cars and servants is not found in capitalist societies. And what that put me of the mind was I remembered back in 2021, a trip I took to Charleston, West Virginia. I was protesting with the West Virginia Poor People's Campaign, and we were marching on the office of Joe Manchin, because at that time, Joe Manchin was like the spoiler that was preventing, Biden from doing all these wonderful things. And so we marched to his office to leave him a letter. And somebody said, hey, there he is, there he goes. And and I said, what? And they said, there he is in his Maserati. And I was like, what? Joe Manchin drives a Maserati. And the guy is so sick that when the poor people come to him to tell him about their suffering, he jumps in this car. It was a convertible, I think, to flash by us on the road. And so that brought me back to the periphery of the imperial core. And I was thinking about Lenin and just his basic idea about imperialism, about how, you go and you colonize here and you colonize there. And then eventually you run out of places to colonize. And I see places like West Virginia in the imperial core as like a cannibalism, where there aren't places to colonize anymore. So it's like, okay, let's try to carve out a patch from within the imperial core to colonize. And so I was thinking about the undifferentiated class formation and how that would relate to someplace like West Virginia. And I was like, well, the deproletarianization that happens with the mechanization of coal mines, for example, can we say that in these areas in the imperial core that have been colonized, can we say the class structure has been sort of like shaped to resemble a colonial class formation?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this
yeah.
is true or not. I think this I could be totally wrong.
Right. I don't know that we could say it in a technical sense, Julie, but one thing we could say is that it stands true to almost point regarding class consciousness, that the class undifferentiated problem, which colonial societies are succumb to, seems to also appear in the example that you just cited. And the consequence for both locales is the absence of class consciousness that would be, well, perhaps precisely because the working class in both locales have been prevented from having a foothold in productive sphere. The conclusion from that could be that as the productive sphere matures, the West Virginian coal miners would have more class militancy than they would now as thrown gig economy, quasi-entrepreneur, lumpenized working class people. And I think that's true. And I think that holds as a general formula for Marxist class consciousness as such. Right? And that is just true historically. If you look at labor militancy in West Virginia, it has a long history. So what does that tell you? I think that it tells you something about this question of the advancement of class consciousness in relationship to a mode of production. So there's almost like a determined relation there, I want to say. Would you say that's true, Julie? How would you theorize that? Like there seems to be some kind of inert passivity when proletarians are not, when their labor is not formed in this sort of stability, which is not like a stability of a utopian panacea by any means. No, there's still a form of domination. But that form of domination opens the possibility of class consciousness more so than this other dejected form. And I think that the parallels there are accurate. I don't see why we should say that they aren't. Okay, this is a very controversial thing. I mean, what do people think about this?
I think it's very controversial, and I'm not really sure how I feel about it. I need to think about it more.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's very fucking compelling. Akshay, what do you think about this or whatever?
I'd like to authorize everyone's claims. Like, I mean, I don't think it's that controversial in the sense that, like, everyone from Rosa Luxemburg, who like famously argued that capitalism always needs an outside and searches for new markets, and this explaining imperialism, but also like the extensive commodification of more things on a different, like, you can qualitatively commodify something more, right? Like, say I'm selling songs, but I can also like start selling bits of the process, or and in that sense, like a lot of people from the like subaltern school and onwards have argued that you are kind of seeing like a return of colonization to the West and in the post colonies, right? Like in these forms of like internal colonization and the whole discourse on immigration and citizenship, like who is excluded from the nation and can be kept in it as a form of like surplus humanity, is like a direct continuation of colonization. Like, why are these people moving in the first place? But yeah, I mean, in the sense that it's one very large structure, but it's also two. It's exactly what Amel is talking about. But to that point, like, and about like national liberation, like, I don't think he's saying, like, I forget where exactly they say near the end, but I think he makes the claim that he's defining national liberation as the abolition of the colonial relation, right? Which isn't just like, so that's not like, and that's by that standard, he can say that the capture of the state is not enough, right? It would need to be a change in how Haiti relates to the United States, right? And which would need a change all across. It's not just in Haiti, right? It's like how every country in the world relates to Haiti, and like, uh, so and that's what I'm kind of a bit like. The one stumbling block I have is like this thing about like an autonomous mode of production, because like all modes of production are like in relationship with like there's social formations in the world, right? Like, so like I get what he means in the sense that like a social formation ought to be in a basic sense be able to like socially reproduce itself. And what's weird about colonization is that they have to reproduce themselves through a circuit that's like parasitical and thoughts development and so on and so forth. But sorry, I don't have a conclusion to this thought. But I guess like, yeah, like I mean, between China and India and like what's going on in these countries, like, you know, is this recolonization, decolonize, like what is the, like in India, I think it is sort of like recolonization, like by other Indians, like, you know, it's especially from the 80s onwards. But anyway.
Yeah, thank you for that, actually. That's very good. No, I'm very curious what folks think about Julie's point. I think it hits on Jonas's sort of comment very nicely. I think the West Virginia case is very very good, a very good one. I go there all the time, and I feel that polarity is very, very pronounced, very, very intense. Connor, please.
Yeah, maybe this will turn on part of what Julie's talking about, but yeah, I just wanted to intervene because, you know, we were talking about the abolition of class and overcoming class just a second ago. Like, I just wanted to like bring us back to baby steps, right? For me, the first thing on the agenda is just raising class consciousness, and that seems to me to be the problem, like on the table, right? Right. So how then do you differentiate amongst classes is the precondition for class consciousness even emerging in the first place, right? And I like to point that out too, because one of my favorite moments in the reading was just sort of like a almost ethnographic digression of just talking about sort of what were formerly peasants moved to the city centers, will work in like small manufacturing, but their lives are really rooted in villages still, right? You know, that is to say, what would, you know, in a properly, let's say, capitalist social development would look like a process of primitive accumulation, the uprooting of peasants and the becoming of urban workers, doesn't take in the colonial situation. Now, this is another way of talking about how the like inability then of social development to appear because we cannot identify classes also then produces the appearance of repetition. And I think then this is like maybe potentially going towards what Julie was talking about. And this is like one of the more provocative, you know, I think we can make a lot of hay out of this point because I think it lends itself to a certain like Fanon way to read what's going on here in regards to registering like forms of subjectivity, right? First of all, what we're talking about is like, are these a people without history? They cannot register development in their own social lives and within their own nation. But this repetition thing also lends itself to repeated behavior. So it's a pathological sort of disposition then that this situation creates for these people. That could even be a provocative claim, but because now we're talking about pathologizing these people, right? But yeah, so is that so dissimilar from people who cannot advance their lives in, let's say, peripheral zones, whether it's in this country or even more geopolitically speaking? So whatever, I'm really just riffing, but
Yeah.
It's something to think about, you know.
Yeah, there's a nice analysis of the status of migrants in Phil Neal's book Hinterland. I can send you the passages that really stood out to me, where he compares Syrian, I think Bangladeshi, West Virginian, and other economic migrants from impoverished places, and he basically makes this like incredible sort of like global he kind of makes them all commensurate, in a certain way at the level of their economic condition, but also their all of like the matrices of their quality of life, the general mortality, birth rate in these regions, like all he starts like a similarity. And then of course, all of them come from hinterlands of like marginal productive zones. Very interesting way. So that's like one reference point I would look at there to do that sort of comparison. I suppose we'd have to ask ourselves like to what are the sort of strengths and weaknesses of drawing out these kind of global comparisons when we analyze the proletarian condition. But that's something we should definitely think about and for future sessions. Matilda, please go.
Yeah, just on this subject, I mean, seems like with like immigrant labor, there's, clearly like colonial relations going on. If you, I guess, exclude that and are just thinking within like deindustrialized parts of the United States, I feel like it might be a hard comparison to make. I think part of his argument relies on the composition like of capital. Like his point at the beginning was like the imperial core countries, like they receive more labor than they send out. Like, and that's because with their mechanization of work, their workers are more productive and each item has less labor in it of living labor. And then what the products they receive are full of variable capital rather than constant capital. So these agricultural workers in the colonial places are the unequal exchange that's occurring is related to the composition of the products that are getting imported and exported. The colonial countries are sending more labor out than they're receiving from the imperial core countries. And when you think about like gig work, like Uber, that person has quite a bit of a machine behind them. And so it might be difficult to come up with an argument related to unequal development or unequal exchange occurring. On the other hand, I think there are remarkable similarities between the Southern economy before the agriculture was industrialized. Like the predominant social relations in the South before the industrialization of agriculture were the merchant banker, the landowner, and the tenant farmer. It's quite similar. However, the possibility of the industrialization of agriculture breaks the comparison. So like, I think his point is that in the colonized countries, there's no hope for the industrialization of agriculture, or like, he says that like the main force of production in these countries is the peasant worker. And so I think like, like you hear the term like internal colonies, like perhaps, like I think like I live in Oklahoma and I think there's good reason to think that a place like this is like an internal colony in a lot of respects, both because of like the displacement of the indigenous people here, the appropriation of land, the tenant farming abuses, and like now it's like we export oil and gas, like I don't know. So there's potential similarities. Like the idea of an internal colony has like intrigued me. I don't know how to think through it exactly, or how to think about unequal exchange within a country. It's a bit obscure. But sorry to be long-winded just for a second. I think it's interesting that, to go back to the comparison with Lacerda's point is that the machines being in the imperial core, the unequal international division of labor that's set up following that, that as national liberation movements occur, that unequal division of labor will be quantitatively remediated, and that there's like the possibility of these national liberation movements to achieve a mechanization of industry that could compete with the imperial cores. And Amel stands in contradiction to that thesis, I believe, because it seems like the colonial relation refuses that development of productive forces. But I think like the point about Lacerda's point is that will lead to basically like, well, I don't know what it will lead to exactly, but it seems like with Amel, it seemed like there was a point about like the rate of profit falling, but I can't remember exactly how he was thinking through that. Okay.
Thank you, Matilda. Very nice. Very nice. I think we'll just take 2 more comments for Khadija and Akshay. Khadija, please jump in.
Yeah, I just had like a thought about the internal colony sort of framework in reference to like Huey P. Newton and the way he categorized, what's happening, or what has happened during his time also with Black people, and also going back to Harry Haywood and his sort of analysis of a nation within a nation. So I do definitely see parallels there, but it becomes murky to me when we're talking about I guess, like white people, like in Oklahoma, in these places that, are kind of still kind of fall into that internal colony categorization maybe, but will still kind of reinforce that by like voting against their own interests. And, and also they have like, they still sort of like, they still have a leg up in terms of like a labor aristocratic class in comparison to people in the periphery who are hyper exploited. So I don't know, it's very like murky to me, but that's just kind of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I wouldn't say that the sort of hinterland proletarian in Oklahoma or West Virginia or these sort of underdeveloped peripheral places in the core imperial core are qualify as labor aristocrats. Although, in a technical sense, labor aristocracy would emerge, I think, in another sort of strata of the working class, particularly related to like labor union work and in that sphere, but also like a lot of work that I've been doing on the theory of labor aristocracy seems that it's entered into a sort of zone of indecipherability and incoherence as a category in today's time, in part precisely because it was reliant on the establishment of large scale of the labor movement, of the labor union movement. And also it had to do with traditionally, at least for Lenin, it also had to do with a certain force that would push against forms of working class emancipation internal to the working class. And so without a workers movement and with a labor union movement that is in such disarray, it's hard for me to theorize the labor aristocracy in the core regions. But that's a
But then
conversation we should have further. Go ahead.
I'm just gonna add, but I would say they still have like a sort of they still reap the benefits somewhat of being inside the imperial core, more than, you know, colonized people inside this country bearing the brunt of the oppression, which would be Black and brown people.
Yeah, I mean I think that may be true as well, but then we fall into a question of how to quantify this, but also what I would wonder would be the question regarding how how we're defining benefits of because and also this question of like their interests and like how they vote and things like this. That's a conversation, Khadijah, we should definitely have, and I'd love to actually work with you on that if you're down. Maybe we could even do like a
Yeah.
podcast on that.
I'm just, yeah, I was just thinking, my thoughts are not completely fleshed out on it. Exactly. Just listening to you guys talk and, you know, what I've read from
Yeah.
this text. But yeah, it is. I say this because, you know, when we think about the undocumented people in this country, and we juxtapose that to like the people in the hinterlands, there is there's a hyper exploitative element of undocumented people that people in the hinterlands are sort of maybe not sort of also contributing to that hyper exploitation on an economic level. And that is also happening to the people in the peripheries as well, is what I'm pointing at.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd like to hear what Julie thinks about that as well. Let's go to Akshay and then Julie, and then we'll close.
Yeah, it was sort of about Matilda's comment and like these so I would just say I forget where exactly, but Amel kind of he says, I'm not talking about unequal exchange in this the exploitation sort of, it isn't exactly about the goods that are being transferred, and he's saying that it's in the relations of production, and in the sense it's internal to the society, right? And I think it's sort of about the orientation of, for example, if India is colonized by Britain, it's not so much like will there be industrialization or not, but the reason there will be industrialization is if it increases the extraction of surpluses in Britain. And it's, you can think about that like very materially, like in Oklahoma, if you want economic development there, how do you do it without entering into the circuits of like New York or something, right? About this question of like relative exploitation and who's more exploited, even colonial governments told their subjects that we give you many rights. And for 200 years in India, there was not much opposition to colonialism. It took a long time for a political party to form. What I mean to say is I think, so the situation of colonization, I think you can describe it as who has control over how you decide your society's future, right? And if you can't decide it, if someone else decides it, if it's routed through, then you can make a strong case for calling that colonialism, in my opinion, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's.
Well, there's also this fundamental ambiguity that we've hit on, which is a very beautiful Marxist ambiguity regarding class consciousness as such, which is that class consciousness I don't think is born from conditions of immiseration. It tends to be born from conditions of relative stability. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox, but I think that I think the young Marx in the 1844 manuscripts is a little, I don't know, a little off about the immiseration thesis, maybe. Julie, did you want to make a final comment? Thank you, actually, for your comment.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I just don't see a benefit in doing like an oppression Olympics to see if we can find like the most oppressed person. I think we all agree that undocumented people in the imperial core are incredibly oppressed, but our goal should always be solidarity.
Right. Well, that's the sort of sort of strange conditional dynamics in which there's a it's also like Amel says, a question of ideology here, because there's an ideological problem regarding the self-understanding of their oppression, which, too often I think we sort of have an easy time to sort of declare that ideology to be reactionary, when maybe we need to exert like more patience with that precise expression of that suffering in some sense. So, that's a whole thing we should talk about. But I think for next time, let's read Ziad's translated piece on Fanon, which I'm very excited to read that. And let's try to read the shorter piece on heritage, cultural heritage, for next Thursday, given that part 3 doesn't exist. But great session, y'all. And peace out. Be well. Bye-bye.